Hello, welcome. Hi, my name is Derek Cowell, and this is my History 17A class. And I just wanted to go over the basically the course and as well as the first week's assignment. All right. So what I'd like to do in the next couple minutes is get your names down. All right. I'd like to not only get to know the names, but also while our meetings will not be mandatory because I understand some people are working, etc. I want to give extra credit points to those who do come. So what I often will do is I give 3 to 5 points for every assignment that is covered during a given Zoom meeting. I'll give that individual on the roster list present a 3 to 5 extra points on his or her score. All right. So basically just a background of my class, okay, is and what you'll need to know, what you'll need to do, what will be expected of you. I need you to, and I will put it in an announcement when I get finished with this meeting. But I need you to get a particular textbook. You should be able to get it used. You can get it on Amazon used, relatively cheap. I say relatively compared to other textbooks that you might find in the office, in the bookstore. It's Alan Brinkley. It's American History, a Survey. And it'll be first edition for you guys. And like I said, I'll have all the information typed out for you on the announcement. And I need you to take throughout the course about six quizzes, and they will not just be factual, right? As far as what happened when, etc., in a given chapter. And I'll let you know in the titles of the quizzes what chapter you'll find the answers in, and they're obviously open book. But I want you to gain some familiarity with each of the major subjects that they have subdivided history, U.S. history into, and gain familiarity with a lot of the data, a lot of the facts that they have chosen, that they have selected as significant at that time period. I think that's the very least that you ought to do, right, in a basic U.S. history course. And then in addition to that, to the 6 quizzes, is I'm going to have 3 tests. You're going to cover about 4 subjects, do about 4 assignments, and then you'll have a test, multiple choice and true false under quizzes in Canvas for you to have some factual questions. All right, again, kind of what happened at this time period. What are some of the basic facts associated with, I was going to say Reconstruction, you guys are 17A, with the Civil War, etc., right? Later on for test 3. And so, but not just that. I don't want to stop there, because to me, history needs to have utility. It has to have usefulness to your lives, right? And memorizing the dates of Civil War battles, etc. I mean, for a history nerd like myself, that's fun to do, but it's not necessarily useful for all students, especially for students who are not going to major in history. So what I want to do in taking my class a proverbial step further is I want you guys to critically think. So what I do from week to week, and luckily for you guys in the fall and spring semesters, the schedule is spread out well enough that you do just about an assignment per week, which shouldn't be too burdensome at all, especially even if you're working. But you'll have about a week each time. And so I extend it, for instance, to Monday to Sunday night, okay? And what I have is I have argumentative sections, okay? And what I put in there are I deliberately, manipulatively select facts and choose to omit others that don't go along with my point, okay? I try to support a given thesis, right? A main argument, that's sometimes more than others, highly, subjective, right? Where, objective are like the laws of gravity, etc., right? There's no arguing against them. They objectively exist. If something is subjective, I don't mean to be pedantic. You guys probably already know what that means, but even if there's one student who's not familiar with that term, it's argumentative, right? It's up in the air. So at any rate, these are subjective. Okay, so I don't mind at all. I've almost intended such for sometimes for you to disagree with the thesis. All right, but what I ask that you do is that you read all sections, because I can't stress this enough. So much of your test comes from these argumentative assignments. The vast majority of questions come from these weekly argumentative assignments. So please, please, please read all sections. But almost without exception, I think there are a couple times where I ask you to do 2 sections. Most of the time, I'm going to ask you to simply do 1. And I want you to analyze. I want you to pick apart what the thesis is, how it's being supported, okay? And then I want you to evaluate, put value on how credible, how believable, how fair, how strong is the argument in your estimation. And of course, that part is completely up to you. Excuse me. And so that part's completely up to you. And there's no right or wrong answer on the second part. There is on the first. There's an intended thesis each time. I expect you to discern what that section's thesis is. So you can be right or wrong on the analysis, on picking apart what the thesis was. The second part, your evaluation of it, that's up to you. And I look to just how intelligently and how well you defend your evaluation, whether it be highly critical or be supportive of the section's thesis. Because sometimes when I put these sections together, okay, I've done it a little bit with like tongue in cheek, with a grin on my face, thinking, well, there's more to this subject than what I'm putting. I'm being pretty manipulative here. I'm conveniently omitting certain information, certain facts that would not stand well with this thesis. So please remember that each thesis I have, oftentimes it's a thought-provoking book that I thought was just interesting. Whether I agree with it or not is an entirely separate issue. A certain professor back in the days that I had sat under and had a very opinionated lecture on the topic, et cetera, okay? So to me, those of you, and oftentimes it constitutes the majority, who are not going to be history majors, it has more utility for your life because you're critically thinking. And it should be, somewhat, to whatever degree, however well I can do it, honing your critical thinking skills. And then for the few of you who do become history majors, I like to think that I'm giving you an early step as to what lies ahead. In your upper division work, especially if you do, post-bachelor work, almost everything is argumentative, okay? And so to me, right, historians, they select facts. And when they select facts, they oftentimes already have a key question that they're asking, key assumptions that they're making that will dictate what facts they select and what facts they omit or leave out. Then they organize those facts. Some people look at the same facts and they come up with different conclusions about those facts. And so the selection of facts, the organization of facts are, I would make the argument, are not necessarily objective. Now, are some points better, more factually and logically, substantially supported than others? Absolutely. But still, there's a lot of subjectivity in history. So I want to play with that. I want to work on your critical thinking and see what you think. And I'm not being falsely modest when I say that I learned from you guys as well. I never fail to learn reading through your responses where I'll literally think to myself, I never thought of it that way. That's interesting. Now, when you're doing this, can you look into supplemental things? Can you look at the textbook and utilize that? Can you go to a website and utilize that, of course. And I like to think that I give a higher grade, even extra credit points for doing such. But do you technically have to? No. So technically, you don't need the textbook on these argumentative assignments. You could just look at what is provided you in that assignment and go from there, just using your own logic and reasoning, and that will suffice. I also, it doesn't have to be, especially if it's very accurate and what your analysis of my thesis was, and you give an educated, an intelligent response as to how credible you think it is. It doesn't have to be that long, but so I don't technically grade on length. But with that having been said, oftentimes when it's less than half a page, most of the time, I find that it's not very in depth. And so that's just something to think about, okay? Some are very adept at getting right to the point, giving very factually and logically rich sentences, and just 5 or 6 sentences. So sometimes they can get away with that, but just be mindful of that, okay? Oftentimes, the responses that are at least half a page, usually I consider more thorough as far as your analysis and evaluation of the section. And on the tests, as well as the quizzes, is I'm not just factual, because again, I don't think there's a lot of usefulness to that in your lives. So what also I am is historiographical, and that's just a fancy word for the art and science of history, right? So for instance, court history. Court history is when you justify the winners in history. And oftentimes we borrow from other social sciences in history, like sociology and psychology, etc. So like from sociology, we tend to put history into at least 3 categories: political, economic, and social, right? So who politically determined the system of government and ran it in history? Who economically gained the lion's share of resources and even determined what type of economic system would prevail? And then thirdly, who socially dictated culture and values and how kids were brought up and what they believed as normative behavior, etc. That would be an example, especially if you have the same category of the population, the same demographic that was able to dictate all 3, that would be declared a winner, right, in history. Court history, for instance, defends the winners. It justifies what they did, right? Oftentimes we receive court history as kids in elementary school. So the founding fathers, right, were wonderful. They were heroic. They were idealistic. I'm going to get back to that in just a minute. And so they justify and they praise what they did, right? That's court history, C-O-U-R-T, like an emperor telling his or her court scribe to write a history of himself. Of course, right, if that scribe wants to keep his or her head, they're going to contend that emperor and everything he did was wonderful. Then also with court history, at the micro level, it praises our winners. And at the macro level, it praises our country. And so you probably have heard this term, American exceptionalism, whereby it contends that we are a special country, that we're better, right? We're uniquely better than the average nation in the world. And so for one, right, we are exceptionally, supposedly, a nation of opportunity, right? That this is a land of opportunity. So that's court history, where it praises access to land, high wages, right? Opportunities for geographical mobility to move around and start anew, right? Access to credit, etc. Then also, they contend that we are an idealistic country, that the average country, right, is simply born upon ambition, desire for resources, power, right, etc. but not us. We were born on lofty ideals tied to the Enlightenment and to other intellectual movements that we'll go over in class, so that we're a special country that's better, basically, right? So that's court history. Then you could take somewhat of a 180 and you could look at Marxist history, right? Like named after Karl Marx. And with Marxism, right, they contend that the capitalist system that we devised, in particular after independence, is inherently parasitical. For one person to succeed, another person has to suffer, right? And so hence the rich, right? They gobble up the poor. They rule at the expense of the poor. And so with Marxist history, they take a 180, and those who quote have won in American history, right? Especially when you get into the capitalist system really coming of age in your 17B class, the time of like the robber barons like Carnegie and Rockefeller, et cetera. They're going to contend, right, that those who won are villains, are bad guys, right? They vilify them. And they contend, they try to elicit your sympathy, your empathy for those who have lost. So demographics like poor, tenant croppers, obviously slaves, Native Americans, women, right? And so Marxist history, it empathizes with those from below. It contends that the system is inherently unfair and rigged for the rich. And they try to elicit your empathy for those at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale or pyramid, okay? And so then you have also post-civil rights movement history, right, or historiography. And that's where they look at demographics. It's oftentimes laced with Marxist ideology, again, where they want you to empathize with those at the bottom of the scale. They somewhat vilify the system and those who have been dictated as like the winners of the system, okay? And they focus on certain demographics that have lost, and they demonstrate victimization, right? How they've been victimized. So again, ethnic minority groups, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, women, okay, gender. And they look at victimization, and then they don't stop there because they find that to be a little bit condescending and just simply getting us to elicit our pity for them. Is then they demonstrate agency, agency. An agency, right? We'll go through that in our history course as well. Is contending that, hey, this demographic may have in many ways lost politically, economically, and socially in US history, but they still made decisions. They still engaged in behavior that served as a catalyst to how events turned out. They still were moral agents with free will, and they utilized that free will and that moral agency to help turn events in the way that they went, right? So a classic example of that is economic contributions, right? Like what had things have been like if it had not been for slave labor, for Hispanic and Asian labor in the mines and on the railroads, et cetera, right? Without the work of women in the home and also in the public sphere. And so at any rate, that's post-civil rights movement historiography. And so you have that as well, okay? And so notice, right, history is pretty subjective. Whatever your concerns are, whatever your key questions are, whatever data that you want to get to and answer in response to contemporary issues, right, that we think about and struggle with today, oftentimes will dictate what facts you select and how you interpret or organize those facts, right? And then when you organize those facts, oftentimes, like I said, we borrow from other disciplines, psychology, sociology, anthropology, et cetera, as to why things happen. Because when it gets into causation, what caused the Civil War? What really in a macro level, trying to encompass everything that had an effect. What really contributed to the Civil War? Was it inevitable or was it avoidable, etc.? Right? What contributed to industrialization, etc.? That you're getting in on slippery ground. Okay, where historians with big degrees from big universities they disagree. So I wanted to utilize that to give those of you who are history majors kind of an early step into historiography. And those of you who are not history majors, I'd like to think that it makes class a little less boring, putting it in argumentative fashion. And it's more useful to your life, I believe, because it's making you think. Okay. So you're going to have about 16. You're going to have about, what is it, 16 weeks? Let's see here. No, you guys actually have 17. Okay. So what you're going to have are 14 assignments. Of the 14, at least 12 or 13 of them are argumentative in fashion. Okay, I'll have a couple exceptions where the format won't be the same, just a couple times throughout the whole semester. So most of the time they'll be in the layout that I just described, an argumentative format. All right, you're going to have 14 of those, and then 3 of the other 3 weeks, you're going to have an entire week to do your test. And like I said, you're going to do a test after about every 4 subjects. I'll have the syllabus up, give you a week to week, preview of what's expected. Please contact me via Canvas message if you have any concerns or questions or anything that I need to be familiar with on these assignments. Okay. I'm trying to lay out a concrete, rather than it being kind of arbitrary, a concrete format as far as grading late assignments. So for instance, in fairness to those who do them on time, okay, I've often taken off 10 points from the score if you turn it in late. All right, 10 points. And every now and then I'll notice that someone turned it in just after midnight and missed it by a few minutes. And I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to shave off 5 instead of 10. This person missed it just by a few minutes. But otherwise, most of the time I shave off 10 points in fairness to those who did it on time. And then sometimes, right, because I really want my students to pass and to do well in my class, it never fails that I will have a student or 4 or 5 who don't seem to be turning in the assignments throughout the semester. And suddenly I get a Canvas message from them saying, Mr. Cowell, can I turn them in for partial credit? And I said, sure, because I want to help you guys. I want you to do well in my class. But I also want to be fair to those who have been doing them the whole semester. So at that point, right, when we're talking, your assignment is over a month old and it's getting toward the 2/3 of the semester, and now you're finally doing some of the early stuff, what I will do is shave off at least 20. So the best you can get is 30 out of 50. I feel like that's only fair to those who are doing them, but it's also balancing a little bit of kindness, because I want to help you as best as I can. And I want you to do well in my class. And without having been said also is, if I put a strict criteria on for what I will grant as exceptional, like COVID, right? Then if it's not on that list, then technically I can't grant you mercy. I'm sorry, it's not on the list, etc. So I honestly do it for you and not for myself. But I reserve for myself in the syllabus the right to use my own discretion to grant exceptions. So, and because I've had some crazy stories, you guys, some crazy stories, tragedies, etc. And, God forbid it happened with any of you. And so I give myself that out, that every now and then someone will convey to me, and not something, trivial, not, oh, I have to look after my kid not that that's trivial, but you know what I mean? I still feel like, okay, but you have a week to do each assignment, you can still do it. But something really heavy, I reserve the right to say, you know what? And I'll personally respond to you in a Canvas message and say, you know what, just get it into me as quickly as you can. And I won't shave off any points, or I'll only shave off 5 on yours. Okay. So I'm not trying to play God, but I'm trying to give you guys as much wiggle room as possible to help you out, because there's no predicting the unique variables that will occur in your and my life. All right. And so these Zoom meetings, what I'd like to do is I'd like to do at least one a week, go over that week's assignment, see if there are any questions, etc. Try to give heavy hints as far as what I was trying to convey in each of the sections. All right. Do the same on the test weeks to kind of go through the test and help you prepare for them. All right. And that constitutes the class. So you'll have 14 largely predominantly argumentative assignments that usually are just one a week. You have an entire week to do them. 3 tests, and then you have 6 quizzes. And the quizzes I'm going to mark back, and they're not going to be due until the time of test 2, a good month into the class, because I want you to have plenty of time to get your textbook. All right. So technically before then, on your argumentative assignments and even on test 1, I'll help you out with the textbook questions, assuming that you may not have had the opportunity to receive your textbook yet. But I do eventually need you to get one. All right. And that constitutes the class. Basic familiarity with the data by way of quizzes and a textbook, and by way of tests. Okay. And then get you to critically think and familiarize yourselves with historiographical debates on different topics, and that through the argumentative assignments. All right. So are there any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
Are the meetings going to be same time every week?
Yes. Yes. So like I said, I should have everything. I'll post everything by Monday, no later than Tuesday, and I'll give you until Sunday night at midnight to do it.
Okay. I tried purchasing your book on the bookstore, but whenever I add the class, it says that there's no book for this course. So are you gonna add it on the bookstore?
Yes, I'm going to give them a call. But like I said, I don't know what they're able to do at this late of a juncture. That's why I'm giving you, like a month. I'm giving you at least a month before anything is due from the textbook, because that's on me. And anytime I make a mistake, I don't want you to be punished for it. And so I failed to register it through the school. And so if you don't want to wait, like I said, I'll give you the information on the textbook today by way of an announcement. I would recommend just going to Amazon or some online source and buying a used one for much cheaper.
Okay, and one more question. Where can I find the syllabus? Because I was looking for it this morning, but I couldn't find it.
Oh, I need to put it on there. I'm sorry. I haven't posted it yet.
Oh, okay.
I'll post that today as well. Okay. I apologize.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Anyone else? I'm going to continue to write your names down, give you some extra credit points. Sorry, I'm a terrible multitasker. So yeah, I will have the syllabus on there for you today. But that which I've covered today, that basically is all that will be entailed in the syllabus regarding expectations of your work. Argumentative assignments, weekly ones, 3 tests, and 6 quizzes. and the quizzes are the only ones that are directly out of the textbook. Okay. So I believe I have all the names down. So what I want to do is I want to share the screen. And let's see here. I have tests, other things. Bear with me here. I had thought that it was open. Let's see here. Okay, so the Native American assignment. All right. So on this again, please read all the sections, but choose to analyze and evaluate one. All right, and turn it in. Each of them is worth 50 points. As I stated on the first one, your first quiz, you could take as many times as you like until you ace it. Your first test, you could take as many times as you like until you ace it. And your first assignment, if you put forth an effort, you automatically will get a 50 out of 50. All right. Just kind of gets you transitioned in. So with number one, I try to give a lot away by way of the title: ambiguity or uncertainty regarding Native American history. And I have it in red there, right? That science can only take us so far. So look for examples of that if you choose to do number one. But again, if you don't choose number one, there still is likely a question on test one from this section, from virtually every section. So please read it regardless of if you choose it or not. All right, I can't harp on that enough. And so at any rate, you have carbon-14 dating, tree ring dating, stratigraphy, isotope analysis. A lot of this stuff is above my head as a social science guy. The hard sciences are tough for me. But I did my best to try to learn and put down the basics of each of these, technologies or methods, and trying to discern when something happened. Because when it comes down to it, right, we have a scarcity of written, documented history from Native Americans. And so that we call that a primary source, right? Something from that time period, particularly written and dictated at that time. So we have a tough time trying to try to take this fact over here, that fact over there, and try to put them together logically and form a hypothesis as to what may have happened. Okay. So for instance, for the longest time, there was a theory by a guy named C. Vance Haynes. Okay. And he concluded, that's supposed to be C. Vance, not V. Vance. But at any rate, Mr. Haynes concluded that there seemed to have been evidence of a recession in the depth of the oceans across the globe, more than once, right?
Excuse me.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can only see your file. We can't see anything else. The folder. Yeah, we didn't see any slides. We just see your folder.
No. Oh no, I'm sorry. Okay, let me see here. Let me try this again. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Shoot. All right. And so with his theory, right, is the Scandinavian scientists in the 1800s, in the late 1700s and 1800s, derived the notion of ice ages, right? And they have way through isotope analysis, stratigraphy, and other types of analysis of the ocean and of the ice to discern this. And so the latest one that they have hypothesized was the Wisconsin era one, about 13,000 years ago. And so at that time, they have evidence that of a recession of the Bering Sea between Alaska and Siberia or Russia. And so they thought, okay, maybe then they traveled literally across the Bering Sea on land, that it could have receded to such a degree as a shallow sea that they could have on land or via very shallow water via canoe made it across that strait into Alaska. And they have evidence also for the retreating of major glaciers, and they named them, I can't remember, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, I think were their names, of these two big ice sheets that have receded across the North American continent. And there was a gap between the evidence found of this recession between these alleged ice sheets. And they call it the ice-free corridor, right? The ice-free walkway, whereby they could have just walked through. And so that, for the longest time, I know as a child for myself, that was taken as an axiom that you don't even question, that 13,000 years ago, Native Americans traveled from Siberia, Russia, into Alaska through the Bering Sea during the Wisconsin Ice Age and went through the gap of two major ice sheets down into the Americas. Well, in 1997, in Chile and in Bolivia, they found human remains and intelligently designed utensils, cooking and other utensils, and they carbon-14 dated them and found them to be 30,000 years old. Obviously, that's much older than 13,000. So much, if that can be trusted, so much for Native Americans not coming until 13,000 years ago. Then they looked through the ice-free corridor and they looked for a carbon footprint. They looked for refuse, garbage, footprints, burial, other evidence of human habitation and passing through there, right? And they found very little to none. And so hence C. Vance Haynes' theory is no longer taken as an axiom that we can necessarily trust. Another problem is that they could have come through the Aleutian Islands in reed boats, and the reed boats are biodegradable. So they wouldn't be here by now anyway. And so there's no way of proving or disproving that. And as far as their Siberian or Eastern steppe origin, that's also argumentative. In the 1990s, they did DNA tests and they looked for genetic markers, right, through the mitochondrial DNA. And for instance, the Diego allele and the GMAT, which tend to be pretty rare human genetic markers, were found predominantly in those who were tested of Native American background and those of Asian background or Eurasian background. And so to some people, that's pretty convincing. And to some scientists, it's not sufficient. And so it just constitutes one more example, right? Where science, it helps us get out of the proverbial dark. It provides some bright spots where by inference, right? By educated guesses, connecting the dots, they can make some educated guesses, hypotheses, but it surely is not generating consensus, right? Where all scientists in the major fields of archaeology and history, etc., are in agreement with one another, where they feel like there is a secure narrative that has been put together as far as what happened, when, and how with Native American early history. All right. So look into that if you would. That basically is what I tried to intended to convey with number one. All right, is that science can be helpful, but it can only get us so far. Number two, when you look at the chroniclers were early modern, like the 1500s and 1600s, early modern Europeans who traveled here, and they wrote pieces, right, and they tried to convey a sense of objectivity, like an anthropologist, right, coming to live with a certain tribe in South America or something, where they tried to objectively convey what they observed, what they could put together as far as the historical accounts of that people, and just give a contemporary at that time period in the 15 and 1600s, uh, just overview of these Native American tribes. And they were known as chronicles, and those who were writing them as chroniclers. But the problem is, right off the bat, you have to um, confront the possibility that their information could be erroneous or could be short on facts, uh, for both intentional and unintentional reasons. The intentional, right, is oftentimes it didn't take long, and the early modern settlers or invaders were at war with many of the Native American tribes. And so hence they would have had um, an ulterior motive to try to stigmatize the Native Americans. And as you'll get into with the Black Legend of the Spanish in week number 2, they oftentimes did that into two paradoxical images. Is one is sometimes they conveyed the Native Americans as childlike and innocent, but in a very condescending way, right? Like, oh, these poor natives, they're walking around, they're still scarcely clad, almost naked, like a child who's not ashamed of being naked. They're unfamiliar with war technology. They're unfamiliar with European notions of greed and a monetary system of coinage and commerce. And so hence, right, that type of image is conducive for paternalistic institutions. It's conducive for the early modern European Americans or Euro Americans to say, you know what, we're going to teach you backward natives how to live properly. We're going to civilize you, right? And then the other paradoxical image that was often conveyed or hinted at or suggested in the chronicles was the savage, right? The godless, demonic savage. And so you find that with subsequent historical investigation, not to mention in Mesoamerica in particular, like in Mexico, the Native Americans had written accounts. They were known as codices, like a codex is a singular form. They're pretty much books, parchment books, in which they wrote hieroglyphic information in them, and also oh, don't fail me now, the petroglyphs, right? The stelae, STELAI. A stela, right, was like an obelisk, a big rock formation that had hieroglyphic writings on it. And oftentimes it was top down political military history, given accounts year by year of the major wars, the major coups and takeovers for the emperor's position, etc., civil wars, etc., that were written down on those stones or in those codices, those books. So subsequently, eventually, we got our hands on more primary sources than previously known. Then also, again, science has helped us with stratigraphy and studying the layers of under the earth and the sedimentary layers and the common things you find in a certain stratigraphic level that seem to have existed at the same time period. Archaeology, anthropology, etc. So now we feel better about surmising certain facts about early modern Native Americans. And what do you know? Those facts fly in the face of the condescending writings of the chroniclers. So that the chroniclers, right, said, oh, there weren't that many Native Americans and they weren't very civilized. They hadn't constructed much. They hadn't devised much institutional wise. And, you know, it could have all been just justification for taking them over, right? For instance, the Spanish literally had a legal term called tierra vacía, empty land. So that if they felt like if the Native Americans or another non-Christian group throughout the globe were not inhabiting the land in high numbers, if they were not building and constructing cities, if they were not cultivating the earth and farming, right, that they did not have the legal standing to keep their land. Believe it or not, that was an early modern legal assumption, an argument made by the jurists, Jurists, the lawyers and law interpreters of the early modern era of Europe. But on number two, right, number two defends the Native Americans and says, but wait a minute, there's evidence that there were plenty of them. This was not virgin soil or tierra vacía. There's evidence that they cultivated the earth. There's evidence that they constructed great cities, highly populated concentrations of people, that they engaged in artistic development, scientific development, etc. So number two tries to fly in the face of the chronicles that stigmatize the Native Americans as either savage or as childlike and backward. And number two tries to convey the fact that that's just simply not true. And many of you have probably have studied, at least heard a little bit about the Aztec in particular, and some of the civilizations just in Mesoamerica alone. And pretty impressive. Over 250,000 people in Tenochtitlan, Mexico, floating gardens, a two-tiered public education system, libraries, drawbridges, hospitals, a sophisticated system of noblesse oblige, of the nobility's obligation to look after the poor, a sophisticated pantheon of gods and religious rituals and hierarchies, clergy and services, which did unfortunately include human sacrifice. So oftentimes what the Europeans do, like in light of number two, is they've made this arbitrary criteria to decide how civilized another group is. And oftentimes it seems to be manipulation of the environment. To what degree are they manipulating their surroundings? Are they building megalith, architecturally? Are they farming the earth and cultivating the ground, etc.? Another one is forming a complex society whereby instead of just having, hunter-gatherers, a chief and warriors, that they develop a sacerdotal or religious elite. They develop an urban artisan class of skilled workers. They develop a merchant class of traders. They develop a sophisticated plantation system with landowners and sharecroppers. They may have slaves. And a sophisticated system whereby they naturalize, if you will, people from other tribes, in particular what they do with prisoners of war amongst other native tribes. So how well do they manipulate the environment? To what extent can they establish dense populations of multiple classes, right? Technological innovation, to what extent, did they succeed or not succeed in that? The Europeans are using this as their measuring stick, as their barometer, and judging how sophisticated Native Americans were or were not. Intellectual and artistic endeavors. Did they write poetry? Did they have music? Did they engage in, the arts and sciences? Anything approximating philosophy, history, dictation, literature? And then, of course, religion. And of course, the Native Americans could not win with that because they had not heard of the Christian Holy Trinity, right? Of the Father and the Son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. So Christianity had not been introduced to them. And so they, on that last criterion, they were going to be termed as pagan and didn't stand much of a chance. So with number 2, it looks and says, hey, okay, well, although putting that criteria on the Native Americans is neither ethical nor fair, the Native Americans hit that criteria pretty darn well. They were not just these meek sheep, as Las Casas called them, like innocent little children that were, in a very condescending way, devoid of any kind of in-depth knowledge of anything associated with modernity and civilization. And they were not just demonic savages either. All right. And then if you choose number 3, as you read through it regardless, is again, I try to tell much in the title, native common traits that elicited harm. Now, note, when I put number 3 together, I'm not saying that this is okay. I'm not saying that they deserved it or that they're to blame for it. I'm saying it's the ugly truth. It is what it is. It happened. There's no changing it. That because of certain cultural beliefs and practices associated in particular with religion and with private property, allocation of property, that the Europeans or the Euro-Americans, invaders that came here, negatively stigmatized the Native Americans because of these differences in belief and practice, in religion and property. So God is in all things, pantheism, as opposed to a sovereign God who created creation and he's separate from it, like in the Bible. Shamanism, Native American individuals coming as go-betweens between the gods and men, and engaging in purification rites and engaging in sacrifices of different sorts and placating the gods through rituals. The Euro-American Christians are going to see that as pagan, as unnecessary. All right. The notion of property being allocated for use only, that was largely held by the native tribes, was different from the notion of proprietorship back in Europe, whereby you are the owner of that land. As opposed to usufruct is the term that the Europeans would use, that they contended that Native Americans used in practice. That no, it's yours for now because you're using it. And when you cease to use it, it'll be allocated to somebody else. So this is going to lead obviously to disagreements and misunderstandings when it comes to land transactions between Native Americans and Euro Americans, where Native Americans believe that they are simply selling, they're simply kind of lending their land to the Euro Americans for their use presently. And the Euro Americans, of course, contend, no, this is ours permanently now. We're the proprietors, we're the owners now of it. So these differences with religion and with property ownership, for better and for worse, largely for worse, these differences encourage and equip Euro Americans to deal condescendingly with Native Americans as if they were better or superior to them. All right, so please read all the sections and please just choose to submit by Sunday night an analysis and an evaluation of one of them. And please note for you guys, I was able to bring over my summer semester's videos. So you don't have to wait, because sometimes it'll take me a good day because of my ignorance with technology. My wife helps me, to be honest, and I have to wait for her, and she's very busy to help me post these. And they have to download. It takes hours for them to download anyway. So instead of always having to wait for these, right? Notice that I have a list of last semester's videos on each of these topics. So by all means, if you feel motivated, take advantage of those videos and look at them where we cover these subjects. All right, so are there any questions about the class, about this assignment? You'll get the hang of this, you guys, in no time. So just weekly argumentative assignments for 3 to 4 weeks, or sometimes 4 to 5 weeks, then a test, then about 4 more, then another test. And a good month into the semester, I will send you announcements reminding you that you have some quizzes to take. And that virtually constitutes the whole class. Argumentative assignments, 3 tests, and 6 quizzes. Please be sure, okay, to submit at least one of your first 2 assignments on time, because at the end of week 2, I'm obligated to drop no-shows. And especially online where I can't see you, right? If I don't see anything turned in at the after next Sunday evening from either assignment 1 or 2, I almost have to assume that you're a no-show. So yeah, by all means, please be sure to submit at least one of the first 2 on time. All right, any questions? All right. If you have any questions or comments, contact me via Canvas message and I'll be happy to respond. Okay. And I'll get the syllabus up there whenever I finish. I have a few more um, uh, Canvas Zooms to do today. But by the end of the day, I'll have your syllabus up. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, thank you. If there are, please unmute yourself or raise your hand so I could see. All right. Thank you.